All right, we left off and want to come to this first portion this morning, concluding the major themes of this first section of the Torah, the first major division, which we know as Genesis. And we looked last time at the Noahic covenants and saw really how everything in the first 11 chapters of Genesis lays the foundation for and points to this covenant that God enters with Noah, and then in particular in chapters 10 and 11 we see then the consequences after that covenant is made. And again we are introduced to a basic biblical concept, which is God is a loyal covenant keeper, and man is not. Man is rebellious against God. And so because of that rebellion that culminates in Genesis chapter 11, God had said and reaffirmed in the Noahic covenants that man was to fill the earth, and instead of dispersing in their multiplication, in Genesis chapter 11, they came together. They came together, chapter 11, verse 2, in the plain that is in the land of Shinar, and settled there. So we have this growth that is taking place in the progeny of Noah, but instead, again, of scattering, they're in this one place. And why are they in one place? Because according to verse 4, they want to make themselves a name, a reputation. They want to be preeminent. And this is an act of rebellion against the Lord. And so the Lord confuses their speech so they can no longer cooperate. And they have to disperse. They have to be scattered to the ends of the earth. Which shows, of course, that the Lord is He is working to make sure that the covenant is followed, but the people have no heart to do so. God is loyal to covenants. The people are not. And of course, what is going to be true of mankind is going to be true later on as we get into the Torah for Israel, the representative nation that God is going to call by means of a second covenant. And that second covenant, which becomes the second major theme of this introductory part of the Torah, is the Abrahamic covenant. And this is a place where the notes actually developed. And then later, back in 1999, I wrote an article based upon these notes on the Abrahamic covenant in the Master Seminary Journal. So everything I'm going to say in the next few minutes is written out with many more words in that article. But just thinking in terms of in a way in which the covenant with Abraham, in a sense, sums up, what is in this first part of the Torah. That in Genesis 1:1 through 11:26, we see the need for this covenant. It is interesting as God gives the promise that is foundational to this covenant. He says to Abraham in chapter 12, verse 2, that he would make Abraham's name great. And name was very important, as we've already seen in Scripture, that in Genesis 1, in the creation account, after God makes something, He names it, He calls it. And so to give something a name shows one's authority over the one that is named. Significantly, in Genesis chapter 2, as God had told Adam that he was to exercise authority over the animals, chapter 1, subdue and rule over the earth, and that includes the animals in the sea and the air and upon the land. And in chapter 2, in the garden, he brings the animals before Adam, and Adam does what? He gives them a name. All right, that is showing his authority, his rule over the animals that he names. Now, giving a name has the idea that not only you have authority, but the name itself is in some way representative and reflective of that which is named. That is seen in, again, chapter 2 with the man, when the woman is brought calling her woman, Isha, out of Ish, because of her association with man. In other words, the names are not random. And then, of course, later on with Abraham, beginning life as Abram, exalted father who becomes Abraham, father of a multitude, and Jacob, foot grabber, who becomes Israel, one who wrestles with God. Name changes are given because something about the character, something about the characteristic of the individual is changed, and therefore that is reflected in the name. So a name in some way represents the person, and the one doing the naming has authority over that individual. And here is the Lord saying to Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. Right? What he's saying at that point is, Abraham, by my authority, you are going to exercise an authority in such a way that your name is going to become a name that is known throughout the earth. And it's interesting because here we are this morning talking about the name of Abraham. His name has become great, not only while he was upon the earth, but continues to do so, and obviously will continue to be spoken about because of the ultimate seed that comes from Abraham. That when you get to Matthew chapter 1, the incarnate Messiah, Jesus, who as he is born into the line of Abraham. He is a son of Abraham. And so obviously through Jesus, the name of Abraham continues to be known and will be known. That God has made his name great. Now it's significant that God says, I will make your name great, because one of the essential aspects which shows the sin of mankind both before and after the flood is the fact that they want to make a name for themselves. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, he speaks about these Nephilim, these mighty men upon the earth, mighty men of old, men of renown, literally men of a name. That these are mighty men who are seeking a name, making a name for themselves throughout the earth. And then we've already seen in chapter 11 how these progeny of Noah and the plain in the land of Shinar want to make for themselves a name. Otherwise will be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. So unless we make a name for ourselves, we show our preeminence, we show our authority, we show and can declare to the world who we are. We want to make a name. We too want to be men of renown, men of a name. And significantly, that those men of a name in chapter 6 are judged by God through the flood, and those men of a name in chapter 11 are judged by God through the confounding of the languages. And to such an extent today, we don't know who those men were who tried to make a name for themselves. We know no individuals of chapter 6. Who were these men of a name? In chapter 11, who were these men who sought a name for themselves? And so against this backdrop of man's autonomy and rebellion against God, his refusal to allow God to work in their lives, the Lord comes to Abraham and says, among other things, I'll make your name great. In other words, you're going to receive blessing from my hand. You are not going to earn blessing through your own effort. You will receive prominence from me. You will not gain prominence through your own works. And of course, this becomes the essence of the character of Abraham, who was a man of faith, a man who received from the Lord, based not upon his works, but upon his faith, his acceptance of what God promised to him. So with mankind sin, right, how is God going to fulfill the creation mandate of mankind subduing and ruling over the earth, worshiping God, and being the guardians of God's revelation? How is that going to take place? Genesis 1 and 2, when mankind is in sin, how is God going to bring his ultimate blessing upon all of mankind through the nations, Noahic covenants, if the nations, the progeny of Noah, are rebels against God? Well, God, as it were now, begins again and says, all right, through not the nations, but through a nation in a land of the progeny of a man that I will choose, I will enter into covenant with him, and through that bring blessing, not to all of mankind, but blessing to at least some of all the families of the earth that God himself had created. And so in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we see the foundation of the covenant. Here are the promises that God makes to Abraham, which later will be formalized into the covenant. Notice the imperative: go forth from your country, go forth from your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. Now we see elements here going back to Genesis chapter 10, verses 31, 32. We get some idea of what makes a nation biblically. 11:31, concluding the sons of Shem, just as the sons of Japheth and Ham earlier. These are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, that is, according to their nations. And we see in verse 31, here are the three elements which make up a biblical nation. A nation has a common ancestry, the sons of Shem, according to their families. All right, so from Shem, you have these other progeny divided by families according to their languages. So not only a common progeny, but also a common language living in the same land. And so verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by their nations. And out of those nations were separated, these nations were separated on the earth after the flood. That God is the one who has determined through the outflow of his interaction with Noah and his sons that through them would come these families, these nations that have common ancestry, a common language, a common land. Now notice in 12:1, basically what God is saying to Abram is, leave your nation. Leave your land. Leave your relatives. Leave your father's house to the land and go to the land which I will show you. There I will make you a great nation. So basically, 12:1, leave your nation, and as you go to another land, there I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, which could be a follow-up imperative, be a blessing, and Abraham was during his life, or it could be consequential here, that as God works in his life, fulfilling these promises, he would be a blessing. And as he is a blessing, verse 3, I will bless those who bless you. That those who see in Abraham God's blessing and want to associate and unite with Abraham, they too will participate in blessing. What God is saying basically at this point is the only place where God's blessing can be experienced is in relationship with Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who disdains you, the one who says, I want nothing to do with Abraham, the one who says that, all right, I might see God's blessing, I might see God's fullness, his abundance in some way in Abraham and ultimately his progeny's life, but I want nothing to do with it. I resist that. Why would they resist that? Because they want to continue to establish their own name. They want to bring forth their own blessing through their own work, autonomous from God and from what God is doing. So the one who blesses, the one who disdains, God is showing that even as he is making this promise to Abraham, there are going to be some who will associate and some who will refuse and reject. The one who disdains you will not be blessed. The one who disdains you will be cursed. That is the opposite. They're going to come under God's punishment, God's judgments, because of their disdaining of Abraham. And then comes this vital promise that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Which, going back to the very beginning of verse 3, says that there are some ultimately out of every family, not just every nation, but the families that are the backbone and make up those nations. There are some out of all the families of the earth whom God is ultimately going to bless through the fulfillment of the promises that he is making to Abraham. Well, we already saw last time in Genesis chapter 15 when God comes and reminds Abraham that he was Abraham's shield, and Abraham's inheritance, reward, shall be very great. And and Abraham basically says, Essex paraphrase, big deal. All right, no one in my family, no one in my house is going to inherit whatever you've given to me. And even later on in verse 7, when he says, I'm going to give you this land to possess it again, Abraham says, oh, Lord God, oh, Master, Lord, Yahweh, how may I know that I will possess it? How will I know that your promise? And that promise goes back to chapter 12. Go forth from your country. 12:4. So Abram went forth. So the imperative given to Abraham is fulfilled by Abraham. He leaves and goes to the land that God had promised to him. And then in verse 7, as he comes into that land of chapter 12, to your seed I will give this land. Okay, here's basically the reward. Here's the inheritance. The inheritance is going to be passed on. And of course, it's interesting that Abram has just defeated the kings of the east who have come to exercise authority over the land, and he has defeated them. So if he has defeated those who have defeated the kings of the land, he has defeated those who have authority over the land. Now, what has Abraham just, and this is a blessing from God, what he's just accomplished? He has just taken, basically, by military conquest, shown that he is the one who has authority over the land. Of course, king of Sodom is not willing to cede that to him yet at the end of chapter 14. And so here it is. It's like he has won the land, but the land is still not his. And God says, I'll be a shield to you. What you have done is not going to reverberate to your loss, and your inheritance, that is the land, shall be very great, big deal. I don't have anybody, to your seed I'm going to give it. I have no seed. Well, you are going to possess this land. Oh, Lord God, how will I know I'll possess it? How do I know you're going to follow through on your promise that you made in Genesis chapter 12? And God shows he's going to follow through that promise by entering into a covenant. And by the way, it's very interesting in the covenant. Notice in 15:13, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in the land, but I will judge that nation, and they will come out with many possessions. As for you, go to your fathers in peace, you'll be buried in the good old age. The promise of the land is going to come to pass generations after Abraham. But God promises and enters into a covenant. And interestingly, Abram does not pass through the animals, but in 15:17, the Lord does. Notice again, you've got a smoking oven and a flaming torch. You've got cloud and fire. All right, Israelite on the plains of Moab. What is cloud and fire? Who does that represent? Yahweh. And so it is a smoking oven and a flaming torch. There is cloud and fire, smoke and fire, which pass through the pieces. And this is indicative of Yahweh. On that day, the Lord, that is Yahweh, made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your seed I've given this land. Gives the borders, it gives the people who inhabit those borders at that time. This is the land by covenant oath. Now I give to you, Abraham. Well, to have the land, he's going to have a seed. So in the years afterwards, no seed is forthcoming. So Abram, it's just through your seed. So chapter 16, Sarah says, maybe you should have a seed by my handmaids, which is legally mine, but comes through another woman. That doesn't work. And of course, we're still paying the consequences for that, even as we speak. We're still interacting with, Israel and Ishmael to this very day. The two sons of Abraham. But God comes again in chapter 17 and declares that this covenant is going to come through a seed, a son who's going to be born to Sarah. And in affirming that The Lord doesn't make another covenant, but he gives a sign of the covenant made previously. And by the way, that has become a big issue in the last decade. Was there one or two covenants that the Lord made with Abraham? I quickly dealt with it in a footnote because it was just developing within the literature, but in the latest JETS, Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, there's an article that reaffirms the biblical teaching, which is true. From the rest of the Torah through the rest of the Bible, there's only one covenant that is made with Abraham, one covenant that was made with the fathers, one covenant. And we'll see that next week in Exodus 2 and following, that he remembers the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the same covenant that is made with Abraham that's renewed to Isaac and renewed to Jacob. Renewed to Isaac, chapter 26. We'll get there, the reaffirmations of the covenant to Isaac. And then in chapter 28 and 35, reiterated, reaffirmed, ratified with Israel, with Jacob. So it's just one covenant. And what is emphasized in chapter 17 is the sign of the covenant. In chapter 18, you see the purpose of the covenant. Again, if you haven't picked it up and don't remember what was in chapter 12, once again it's reiterated as the Lord speaks to Abraham. He says in verse 17 of chapter 18, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" That is with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation?" Well, how do you know that? Well, he's made that promise, chapter 12. He has given covenant oath, chapter 15. He has given a sign of that covenant, circumcision, chapter 17. And he is in the process of reaffirming the fact that Sarah is going to have a son who will be born in chapter 21. He will surely become a great and mighty nation. God has made a promise and backed it up with covenant oath. That's as good as what? A done deal. He will become a great and mighty nation. And in him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So the place of blessing, the place, if I might put it this way, where God is ultimately going to bring the blessing that he has promised to the nations, the Noahic covenant is now going to come as God is going to fulfill the covenant oath that he has made with Abraham. This is the purpose of the covenant. The purpose of the covenant was, yes, that Israel ultimately would be a great and mighty nation. That prepares us for chapter 19 of Exodus that we'll look at next week. They will be a special treasure. They will be a kingdom of priests. They will be a holy nation. God has that blessing and benefit for them. They will become a great and mighty nation, not that they might just parade themselves and say, "Look what God has done for us." God is doing that for them, that ultimately, as Abraham's seed, they might be what? A blessing to the nations. And when Abraham by faith shows his obedience to the Lord in chapter 22 by not withholding his son, we see again reaffirm the blessing that is going to come through this covenant. 22:16, the angel of the Lord, that is the messenger of the Lord, who is the Lord himself, said, "By myself I have sworn, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." Why? Because you've obeyed my voice. Now, right there, you say, wait a minute, wait a minute. Because you've obeyed my voice? Well, yes. Genesis chapter 12, the Lord said, go. And Abraham, what? Went. Culminating in chapter 22. Offer your son. Abraham obeys. In the midst, Abraham believed God, 15:6, and was accounted to him for righteousness. Yes, Abraham is a man of faith. He's a man who believes God, trusts God, takes God at his word, and responds in obedience. So is God going to fulfill his word because he has made a covenant oath with Abraham? And the answer is yes. God has put it all upon his shoulders. I am going to do this. I am going to make you a blessing. And through your seed, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. But also, all the families of the earth, all the nations are going to be blessed because Abraham obeyed my voice. It's not either or, it's both and. God is going to fulfill his promise because he is God and he has a sworn oath, and he's going to fulfill the promise because Abraham, in faith, was obedient to what God commanded him. Put this in the back of your mind, because that means if God ultimately is going to fulfill his promises with Abraham, it means that he also has to bring about an obedient seed like Abraham. Put that in the back of your mind until we get to Deuteronomy 30. Beginning of the Torah. We'll come back to that at the end of the Torah. I know some of you are going to go right now and look at Deuteronomy chapter 30 to see what I might be talking about. We'll get there. So it's a both and, not an either or. And again, I deal with it in the article that even though God ultimately is going to fulfill the covenant, he's going to fulfill it with an obedient people, a faithfully obedient people. And that blessing is going to come from the covenant to all the nations. And Abraham dies with the covenant that God has made. As I said, is reaffirmed in chapter 26 to Isaac. It was again in verses 4 and 5. I'll multiply your seed, chapter 26. And by your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And once again, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. Abraham was a law keeper. The problem is there was no law. But you see, what is the law? The law is the command of God's given for the direction of God's people. God gave directives to Abraham, and he obeyed. By the way, every time the guy came to Abraham and spoke to him, Abraham always responded in faith with obedience. Abraham got himself in trouble when God hadn't said something, and he did it anyway. So Abraham is shown as a righteous by faith kind of man, and is a reminder to us that the faithful man has to watch out when you don't have a direct word from God and you say, okay, now, how can I work in such a way as to fulfill the promises that God has made to me? That's when Abraham, when he threw himself back on his own devices, found himself, in trouble. Yeah, you can apply that to your life as you might see fit. When we don't have, direct instruction from God and we try to figure out on our own, is when we tend to make a mess of our lives before the Lord, and God has to come and rescue us and And we see that already in Abraham. Well, Israel should have learned that message as well. Because you think about, one who depended upon his own devices, his own schemes to get, what God had promised to him. The ace example of that in Genesis is not Abraham. The ace example of the man who sought God's blessing through his own devices was Jacob. From the womb on. Hey, look, I don't want to trust the Lord being the younger. I mean, he's holding on to the foot of Esau, trying to pull him back and get out first. So, I mean, this all began in the womb. Well, Paul's not reading into Genesis. He's, this battle was taking place, and Jacob was scheming even before he was born. So who says that you don't have character in the womb, as well when you're born? But the womb, obviously, we see it with Jacob, and of course that foot grabber at birth continues to be a backstabber, a deceiver, until finally God tames him toward the end of his life. But the covenant is reaffirmed, and again. The problem with Israel in their history is there's too much of Israel and too little of Abraham. Think about that one. They too scheme and through their own devices, through their own work, seeking to establish a righteousness of their own rather than trusting God to give them his righteousness. They seek to make a name for themselves rather than trusting that God will give them a name. Too much Israel and not enough Abraham, as we're going to go through the history of the Old Testament. And then the covenant is reaffirmed. Well, then I break it down. What are the basic elements of this covenant when you put all this together? There's a personal blessing promised to Abraham. And Genesis chapter 24, verse 1 tells us the Lord did bless Abraham in every way. As he becomes old, advanced in age, God had blessed him. And that blessing was also seen in the fact that he had a great name, even in the land in his own day. And God had blessed him abundantly with many flocks and herds, many tents, many servants, and of course ultimately had given him a son. So God had blessed Abraham. God had given him a great name, and through him was to come, second of all, a great nation. And that meant a nation needs, going back to Genesis chapter 10, well, we've got the common ancestor, Abraham, but they also need a land and ultimately a language. And God will give them that as well. A land and then the nation that comes through Abraham by means of Israel in the land. And some of the promises given are corporate to the nation, multiply. But go back to chapter 22. And again, spelled out in the article. Because seed is one of those unique terms that is singular with a corporate meaning. Singular with a corporate meaning. It's a singular term. So I'll greatly multiply your seed, verse 17, as the stars of the heavens and the sand which is on the seashore. Seed singular or seed multiple? Well, he's going to multiply. So this is looking at what we call the corporate seed, the physical progeny. And your seed shall possess the gate of not their enemies, that's interpretive, but your seed shall possess the gate of his or since we have neuter its enemies. By the way, the only other place we see in Genesis this concept of one overcoming enemies, it is the seed of Judah, which ultimately becomes singular in chapter 49. So we have a corporate, your seed will be multiplied. Your seed shall possess the gate, singular, of his enemies. In your seed. And now the question comes, singular or corporate? And the answer seems to be, on the basis of Genesis chapter 49, singular. Confirmed by Paul in Galatians chapter 3. In your seed, that is singular, and Paul can even add, that is Christ. All the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. And I don't believe that Paul is reading in. I think he's exegeting accurately chapter 22, verse 18. That we move from the corporate, beginning of verse 17, to the singular, that is the Messiah, in 22:17b to 18. And when we see that in this seed all the nations, when it talks about all the nations of the earth being blessed, it ultimately is going to come through this singular seed of Abraham. That's the one, the nations. We'll have to see as the place of God's blessing and associate with him and receive God's blessing. But if they disdain him, they'll be under God's curse. Paul was right. The gospel was preached beforehand to and through Abraham. All right, so there is this individual seed. So the individual seed is what is emphasized in chapter 15 and again in chapter 21. So we can see that seed can mean a particular child, a particular son. Other places in Genesis as well. And of course, ultimately, and very, very importantly, and this is where the Abrahamic covenant then intersects and is the means by which the Noahic covenant comes also to fruition because of the universal blessing. All the families, all the nations. And so some out of every nation, some out of every family, God has already committed himself, will be blessed because of Abraham and the ultimate singular seed of Abraham that is going to come in the future. So there's the Abrahamic covenants. And again, as I said, as you kind of catch the flow, it's all, almost you can subsume everything in Genesis under this covenant. The first 11 chapters build up to chapters 12 through 25, the making of the Abrahamic covenants. And then, of course, chapters 26 to 50 flowing out of that, with ultimately Joseph reaffirming in chapter 50, God is certainly going to visit you, and he's going to fulfill the promise that he has made to the fathers. And on that note, Genesis ends. It ends on a note of reminder that God is a covenant-keeping God. And hear that echo then next week as we get into Exodus. We're going to see a narrative of how God kept at least a part of that covenant that he had made with Abraham. As an anticipation, he's going to fulfill all aspects of the covenant he made with Abraham, which then for Israel on the plains of Moab meant not only does he bring us out of Egypt, Genesis chapter 15, but he will give us the land. We will go in and take the land, as they are poised to do at the end of the Torah. So you can see, again, how Genesis is very, very vital and important for Israel to understand who they are, who their God is, why he has called them, where they are, and how they can, by faith, also be obedient and fulfill what God had said in the covenant promise that he had made to Abraham. Well, then just, very, very quickly, a number of other major themes that we see in Genesis. The third we've already noted as far as the Torah as a whole, but certainly a reminder that Israel's God is the God of creation, the powerful God. The God who in chapter 15, verse 1 can come and say, I am a shield to you. I am your protector. He was truly, for Abraham, El Shaddai, God of the mountain. And as the powerful one, he's already acted in Genesis and creation and the flood. Obviously, throughout Genesis 2, this powerful God is also seen as the sovereign God. And his sovereignty is seen throughout the text, but particularly in chapters 37 to 50. The famous words of Joseph in chapter 50 to his brothers, their actions. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. God is sovereign. He can work through even the evil actions of men to bring about his good. He's a good God who works good. And so we see his sovereignty, and as we said in the Jacob narrative, the Joseph narrative, chapters 37 to 50, in a more indirect way. Obviously, up to this point, it's been more direct. God has come. He has acted. He is sovereign. He shows his authority. But in 37 to 50, it's in a more hidden way. And both aspects are going to be true as we go through the Old Testament. That God is going to be emphasized as sovereign, whether we might put it this way, he is the active participant that is seen in the events, or whether the events are just narrated and you understand behind it all is the sovereign God who is working out the events to his end, fulfilling his plan and his purpose. Don't have a whole lot of time to really develop it, but certainly as you go through Genesis, you see the sin of mankind. Interestingly, the literal term for sin is only used 15 times. That root is only 15 times, to miss the mark. Even iniquity, and transgression. And one of the reasons for this, obviously, is as you go through Genesis, you don't have the proliferation of commands and statutes, ordinances, that are going to come, obviously, beginning in chapter 20 of Exodus and on through the revelation that God gives at Sinai. Now you've got a clear standing. You can talk about missing the mark, of transgressing, of going beyond and disobeying. Significantly, the term that is most used in Genesis is the term evil. The fact that it is the opposite of that which is good. God is good. God brings good. God brings that which is for the benefit and well-being of others. Evil is the withholding of that good. In fact, rather than acting on behalf of the well-being and welfare, is not only withhold that, but to actively act in such a way that rather than benefit, loss is going to come to another. And so this term evil, and of course you can see that very definitely in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And so, evil leads him to act in a way which is against, it is wicked, it's against the benefit of others. It's interesting, first use of evil is in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And by eating, they come to know good by their experience of evil. By experiencing evil, they know the opposite of what we do is what is good. It's interesting that you see they would have come to know good without eating the fruit, because they're in relationship with the good God in a good creation. But seeking to and thinking that somehow there was a goodness that God was withholding from them, they Adam and Eve eat, and they immediately recognize their shame. We see evil proliferating in Genesis 4 and into Genesis chapter 6. And the result in 6:11 and 12, the earth was corrupt, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth, behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. So there's evil, there's wickedness, there's corruption, perversion. And of course, God is going to codify that more and more as we go through the Torah, which that basic evil, that wickedness, that corruption, that perversity, that crookedness is going to be seen as God gives more and more commandments, and Israel will show themselves to be sinners, missing the mark, transgressing against the standard. So, the more commands God gives, the more the perversity of man will be seen. And of course, because of the sin of mankind, there's correlating judgments. Obviously, the disobedience of chapter 3 is met with exile. The disobedience of Cain in chapter 4 is again met with exile. Chapter 6, the sin is met with the flood. Chapter 11, the sin of mankind at Babel is met with God's judgment. The differing languages that he brings forth, the confusion. And chapter 19, the great sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously is met with God's great judgment. Yet through all of this and throughout Genesis, we see the grace of God. His choice of Abel over Cain. His choice of Abram, the youngest son of Terah. His choice of Jacob, the youngest son of Isaac. His choice of Judah, the fourth son of Israel, to be the one through whom the messianic blessing comes. And then finally we have the themes of blessing and curse that we've already been talking about. At the very beginning, how God blesses his creation, and God blesses mankind. And he wants blessing, he wants abundance, he wants good, he wants benefit, he wants blessing, to come to mankind. Yet because of mankind's disobedience, rather than receiving blessing, there is a curse. A curse on the serpent, a curse on the ground, a curse on Cain, etc. The cursing that comes upon those who disdain and seek to act contrary to the Lord. And yet the Lord wants blessing and is going to ultimately, if we might put it this way, be victorious. It is his blessing which is going to be established. It's going to be his blessing which will be his ultimate word. In fact, blessing will be the ultimate word in the Torah as a whole. The last two speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy, the Song of Moses, chapter 32, There's a song that speaks about Israel's perversity and how God is going to bring judgment, the curse of the covenant. Yet God's final speech, Deuteronomy 33, is going to be, these are the words with which God blessed, or the blessing with which God blessed Israel before he died. And by the way, those words of what is going to take place at the end of the days, what's going to take place in the end of the days, for Israel is going to be blessing. For those that disdain God is going to be judgment. But through that judgment, ultimately those who remain will participate in God's blessing that is going to come upon those who are the progeny of Israel. So blessing and curse, and some even see this concept of blessing and God's promise of blessing as the key theme of Genesis. How is blessing going to come? It's going to come through a God who makes and keeps covenants. And so I saw covenant as probably being preeminent as far as Genesis, but it's true that ultimately the covenants become the avenues through which God is going to bring blessing to all the families of the earth. So there is a sense in which those themes are all tied together. The God of creation, Yahweh, Israel's God, the powerful God, the gracious God, the sovereign God, is the God whose plan and purpose to bless mankind and through mankind to bless his creation is ultimately going to come to pass, because that is going to be God's final word. Through the covenants, it's going to be blessing. But in the meantime, those who are cursed will be judged in the future as God establishes ultimately his design and his plan for mankind. And he will do that through the fulfillment and the total experience of the promises he has made by covenant oath to Noah and to Abraham. And there, therefore, is foundationally what we call Genesis. And so the purpose, the God of creation, chose to bless sinful mankind and to reestablish human rule of the earth through Abraham and his seed, singular. And that seed who will come through his physical seed, who will inherit the land. That is the physical seed of Israel that will be that nation through whom the ultimate seed of Abraham is going to come. So all is being woven together at the very foundation of God's revelation in Genesis.